Sara is the 2024 Southwest Conference on Language Teaching Teacher of the Year, and she was a finalist for the 2025 ACTFL National Language Teacher of the Year. So we are in the presence of greatness, and we are very much looking forward to hearing about all the different strategies that Sara has in store for us to support all language learners in our language classrooms. So please help me welcome Sara.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming despite the amazing weather outside. So coming from Arizona, I'm always going inside when the sun is out because we have too much of it, but I totally understand why that's different for you guys. So thank you for taking the time and coming here. So without further ado, Angelica already introduced me, so that's all about me. Let's get started. Executive functions. Why would I talk about executive functions? Any ideas? Any clues? What are executive functions? Has anyone heard of them? How would you describe them?
Self-organization.
Self-organization. Okay. What else? Anyone? Executive functions? Any ideas? Executive functions. I love the explanation that the executive functions are pretty much the CEO of your brain. Okay. So for all the higher order cognitive processes, and they are the foundation for all learning. So to give you an example, when it comes to monitoring and self-regulation, when we think of really small babies, right, the infants, when they're born, they have no self-regulation. They feel hungry, they start crying. They need to poop, they start crying. They have no reason, they start crying, right? So there's like no self-regulation whatsoever. But with time, they are learning that you can wait for 2 or 3 minutes until you get something. So this is the ability, for example, of self-regulation or task initiation or organization and prioritizing. So if you think of the ability of a 3-year-old to cook something in the kitchen, you wouldn't start by starting the fire in the oven. You would start by getting all the ingredients together. So that ability to actually prioritize and organize is extremely important. So we have all these different aspects of executive functions, and all these executive functions are necessary, are the underlying foundation for all kind of learning. And that starts with infants, and that goes for learning throughout your life. Now, there's a lot of research out there on executive functions, and there's actually not one definition that executive functions is always A, B, C. Different researchers have said that, for example, that inhibition in itself is an executive function. Others are more precise, that they're saying these are the subcategories of executive functions. But in the end, all of them agree that these are the main aspects of executive functions. So let's look at these executive functions. Organizing and prioritizing. And here I have more information to kind of give you an idea what that is. Organization and prioritizing is, for example, goal setting or goal-directed behavior. So that means that I'm capable of saying, okay, where do I want to go? If I want to end up in New York City, right, I need to have that goal and not just start walking and hoping that eventually I'm going to get there, right? And the same with our language learners, where it's important to have the goal, where do I want to go and how do I get there? Avoid distractions. So you can tell already we're going into the direction of, neurodiversity and attention deficit disorder. Task initiation means overcoming the resistance to start. We all know our students, right? Where it's like, when do you start actually writing that midterm or working on that final paper, where the question is, when can I start? Come on, motivate myself. Resilience, managing frustration and emotions, and then holding and manipulation of information for working memory. Impulse control, so monitoring and self-regulation. So we're in the classroom and my teacher is asking me who knows the translation of, and I'm the one who knows everything. And I'm like, ask me, please, right? And that control to not jump out there and say, and actually be quiet and wait and take turns. That is here the monitoring and self-regulation. Change of perspective, the mental flexibility. and then the metacognition, so seeing myself from the outside. All these are the executive functions that are underlying all kinds of learning, and of course also our learning in our language classrooms. And because I am a teacher who loves to make people work, I want you to team up with a person, ideally someone who you don't know yet, so you meet some new friends. So if you could please get together with a new partner that you want to work with. Here are all the executive functions. Think of your language learners. If you could build your perfect learner, okay, your ideal learner, how much of which executive function, what is the priority where you say, for my language classroom, sorry, I shouldn't touch myself. I mean, it's never a good thing, but definitely not when I'm wearing a microphone. So if you are, when you think of your language learner, what is the most important executive function that you think has absolute priority that comes first? And then which one is less important? And if you have a pen or pencil, you may even write on there the percentage of what you think should be the strongest one, less strong, the weakest one. I give you like 3-4 minutes to discuss it. So just to summarize what I've seen here in the groups, and I love that, is what happened is one of you grabbed one of them and said, oh, task initiation is so important in my classroom because da-da-da-da, and then it went up. And then someone else had, oh, but organizing skills, oh yeah, that's super important. And you pretty much, it didn't matter which one you were holding, it went all the way up, right? And you're like, oh, it's somehow they're all super important. And that is 100% the answer. The most successful learner is the one who is in all areas more or less on the same level. Because imagine a learner who has a lot of trouble with focusing and sustaining, but has super strong executive functions everywhere else. So very motivated, goal-oriented, has great, wonderful working memory, everything amazing, but simply cannot focus at all. Then all of the other executive functions are in a way useless because of this one function that is not as strong. And that is a big, big problem. Here's some more information on executive functions in our language classroom. So how many of you have heard when you have a new student who says, oh, I want to be fluent, that's my goal? That's not realistic goal setting, right? I mean, I always tell my students, well, you're fluent after the first day because you're saying 3 sentences fluently. So define what's fluency, and then we can talk, right? Then inhibition, really big to avoid distractions. Overcoming the resistance to start, especially in second language learning. We have vocabulary, we have grammar, we have pronunciation. There are so many aspects to language that are really difficult for students to get started because they're like, oh, I feel completely overwhelmed of everything that is expected of me. Resilience is, on the one hand, the discrepancy in proficiency between L1 and L2, that students feel like, why can't I say exactly what I want to say in my L2? Then the stagnation, especially when they have the experience through the novice level, they just shoot through the novice level, and then they're staying in the intermediate level just forever and ever. Complexity of language, we have here new norms, new cultures, change of perspective, very, very challenging in second language learning. And then seeing myself from the outside, cultures and societies, of course, a really, really big thing. So what does that have to do with neurodiversity? Why did I even start with executive functions? Yes, absolutely. Because people with neurodiverse people often struggle with executive functions. Yes. And you see the big one is avoid distractions, inhibition. We immediately think of ADHD when we think of that. So I have another quick question, and you can stay with your current partner. We have a few classroom situations, and I want you to think of when you see those, do you think that could be signs of ADHD and or autism? Yes, no, why? Even if we don't yet have a definition of them, all of us have heard of them usually. So think through these classroom situations and talk just for a couple minutes with your partner about these. Go ahead. This one is a little more difficult, right? Yeah. Do you know these situations from your classroom? Do they look familiar? Which ones are the most familiar to you where you're like, okay, that's definitely something I encounter? Yeah. So you said the classic one is when students say they don't have any questions, but then yes, absolutely. Now, is that a sign though of ADHD or autism? Listening comprehension. Yeah. So it could be, it could not be. It's just not that clear cut. And one of the reasons why it's not that clear cut is, does anyone know how we diagnose ADHD and or autism? Can you explain a bit more what that is? Oh, just a second. Sorry. Yeah, I forgot.
Thank you. Sorry. So a long time ago, these English physicians decided they were going to make this big book of mental disorders. And in order for most diseases, you need to hit a criteria. It'll have symptoms, and you have to hit a certain amount of criteria in order to be diagnosed with that.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. So that means what we do is there's pretty much a questionnaire that you fill out, and then based off the questionnaire that is being filled out by usually the parents, and then one place outside of home, so a school, for example, and then if you hit a certain number, you are being considered, for example, that you have ADHD or that you have autism. Which at the same time means if you have 17 points, you're autistic, and when you have 16 points, you're not. Right? So it is arbitrary in a way, because of course you have to say at one point you are and then another point you are not. But that isn't the whole story, because it's so much broader. So talking about ADHD, just a few facts. So about 10% of children and 6% of adults in the US are diagnosed with ADHD. They're very, very important. ADHD and autism are both spectrum disabilities, and that means they are on the big spectrum. We have the learner who just with a 1 point falls into the spectrum of autism or ADHD, and then we have the one on the extreme other end. And so that also means that on the other side, we have people who do not have the diagnosis, but who are really, really close. And so we have this whole spectrum of learners. This we've already said, the diagnosis through questionnaires. It has to occur for at least the past 6 months in 2 different settings. So for example, home and school. Hereditary and it occurs more often after childbirth complications. So for example, alcohol misuse and a preemie. But other than that, it's really hard to say it will definitely always happen or not, or who will have ADHD. And it often occurs with comorbidities. So anxiety, learning disabilities, depression, where of course the big question is, what started it and what's the consequence? So is it the ADHD that leads to depression because of the limitations you have in life? Is it the other way around? That is extremely difficult. Gender differences, there's very, very interesting discussion in current research about nature versus nurture. So how much is really coming from you and it would have happened anyways in any environment? How much is also in the environment? And also, what is the difference in ADHD in girls versus boys? Is there really a different gender difference there? So far, there are the so-called boy symptoms and girl symptoms, where the boy symptoms are more the physical fidgeting, the aggression and the impulsive behavior, and the girl symptoms, shyness, daydreaming, and low self-esteem. The problem is with ADHD diagnosis, if you take these, ask any parent if their child matches matches any of these, right? And everyone is like, oh yeah, yeah, 100%. So that's making it hard. These are all the areas where ADHD impacts executive functions. So with ADHD, all these executive functions are impacted to a lesser or stronger extent. That depends on the individual. When we talk about autism, autism is a complex neurological developmental disorder, also a spectrum disability. And here's a very interesting statistic. In 1992, 0.2%, 2023, 2.78% of people diagnosed with autism. 30 seconds with your partner, discuss why. What's your best guess? Why is there such an increase? Who would like to share what you were discussing?
I think one of the things we were discussing, the numbers, it's probably that the screening tools or training for diagnosis were not available for, school staff, practitioners, or just anywhere. That's one measure.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Any other thoughts, additional?
Maybe the COVID, because of the COVID, parents spend more time with the kids and then realize,
Great point.
wow, something is
Yeah,
right.
yeah, great point. Anything else? Yeah.
I think also just more awareness about these. They are more recent disorders in the knowledge, in the literature. So as they become more popular, more diagnoses.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is something that we are struggling with right now, where we have the whole extent in research of people who are saying, well, we have narrowed the normal to a point where the majority of people are not falling into that very small area of normal anymore, and everyone has something. And then the others who are saying, no, we've gotten much better at diagnosing and being also the shame of a diagnosis being gone, and more awareness of how we can help people. And that is also what we often see in our classrooms and in schools, that we have some learners who very, very proudly come into your classroom and say, yes, I have autism and I know how to deal with that. And here is what I want you to do. And this is what's helping me. And then we have people who are so terribly embarrassed by their diagnosis that they would never, ever, ever share it, because they so want to just be normal, because a diagnosis still is seen for many people as not being normal. And that's really, really problematic. And we have to be aware as educators that we have both of these people in our classes. And I think that's really important. There are three general differences, very broad differences in autism. The early childhood autism before age 3, with severe delayed speech development and significant problems adjusting to the world, and they're usually not in our regular school system. Then we have Asperger's with average or increased intelligence, the typical speech development, but noticeable challenges in social interactions. So these are people with Asperger's who we see more often in our classes. And then the atypical ones that also start after age 3, a speech development delay can occur, but it's not necessary. And the same with the social abilities that also can occur, but are not necessarily present. Okay, this is what autism looks like when it comes to our executive functions. So these are the main 4 executive functions that are being impacted by autism. And so this is your classroom. So you have, on the one hand, the learner who it really can't sit still and really constantly wants to do something and needs the physical, engagement. And then you have the learner who really can focus and sustain, but who does not have a whole lot of mental flexibility, and everything needs to be done exactly one way. And if it is not done this way, then I'm really struggling to self-regulate. And you have all these learners in your classroom. And it doesn't matter if they have a diagnosis or not. Remember that for the vast majority of our college students, we will not know whether or not they have a diagnosis, either because they feel like my teacher can't help me anyways, or because they don't want to be the odd one out, or because they feel like it's just too much of a bother. I've made it so far. That does not mean that they still need our help. They very much still need our help. And that's why I'm really pushing and hoping that we can get to not waiting for a diagnosis, but that we are getting the resources to look at our students and to say, this is what we need, this is what you need, and I'm going to try to create a classroom that you fit in rather than making you fit into my classroom. I think that's really, really important. What is the ideal environment for learners with ADHD? And I have, by the way, QR codes at the end with the handouts, so then you have all the handouts. To address the inhibition, activity breaks. So even though we are teaching at the university, activity breaks doesn't need to mean we're getting up and watching the Wiggles and do a little dance. I welcome you to do that, but it doesn't need to be that, right? Activity breaks is also cooperative learning methods that we do what we just did. Find someone that you haven't talked to. Get up, find a new partner, right? Instead of doing this activity sitting down, the next activity we're going to be doing standing up. Just a lot of change up and down, left and right. Exactly not doing what I'm doing now is lecturing at you, but actually doing the activity and getting up. Very, very important. Also, seating in the front, assessment with noise canceling headphones, variable and flexible approaches to learning material in different formats. I don't know how many of you are working with universal design, but universal design is extremely helpful to address the different needs of different students. So for example, and there it's important to think about what is the objective. If the objective is, for example, that I'm able to show that I can apply vocabulary from the grocery store, I can, for example, have a video for a learner with ADHD who has super great creativity to go in the store and then take a video talking about what's there in the store using different German vocabulary, right? And for a learner with autism who's really wants to do it correctly and perfectly and rather works by him or herself, then maybe they can write a dialogue, right? So having universal design, thinking about the objective that we're looking at, and then creating these activities in universal design is extremely helpful. So here, assignments that are fitting the learner's learning preferences, individualized assignments. And here is where usually my high school teachers are saying, how many hours are in my day to do that? 100%. This is not, it's not called the realistic environment for a reason. It's called the ideal environment. Why do I show you this nevertheless? Because if you implement just one of these things, that's already going to help your neurodiverse learner. So what I want you to do is that you look at all these different options and you pick the one that fits into your learning environment, and that's really going to be helpful for you. For learners with autism, minimize overstimulation, take breaks when overstimulated, and at the beginning work with consistent partners. That's really helpful because that gives a sense of safety, that gives a sense of I know what we are doing and there's not too much change. Now, this is pretty much the exact opposite of what I just said about ADHD, right? And that exactly makes teaching so hard, because you have the students who constantly want to walk around, who love cooperative learning methods and want to work with you and then with you and then with you. And what's your dog's name and what's your grandmother's favorite recipe, whatever, right? And then I have the student who's saying, but we were supposed to talk about this today. Can I please write this down? And that makes it so hard. Okay. So here again, we have the overview of ADHD and autism, the ideal situation of what we can do. And again, please take this not as I need to achieve this, but take this as a suggestion and a way of what you can possibly do to help your learners. Any questions so far? So much.
So for a student who has both diagnoses, how do we incorporate?
Totally depends. Oh, I have a thank you. Totally depends on the individual learner, because both ADHD and autism are, we both have the whole range. It could be that one learner is more like stronger on the autistic side, but not as strong on the ADHD side. So you could have a learner who wants a lot of cooperative learning methods and has the urge to be social and to socialize, but at the same time has the struggle that that they want the social interaction to go a very certain way. And so there, what I would probably do is to do the cooperative learning methods, but at the same time do it with the same person. So in this sense, so that they have the security that they need in the one area, while they also get the positive aspects of the other, if that makes sense. Yeah, that's the big problem with that it's not isolated and that there are so often the comorbidities that go with it. 100%. Yes. Also, solutions for everyone. So visualize activity, steps, and goals. Contextualize new vocabulary and connect to prior knowledge. And this is all where we're all like, yeah, of course, we all do that as language learners, right? That should be a given. But it's especially important for learners with ADHD and autism. Don't change too much, but do use cooperative learning methods. So for example, if you say, I love think, pair, share, then I'm going to start with that. Or I love whichever other method, then start with that. But don't introduce the next one until maybe week 3 or 4. And then differentiate culture activities, and always super important, rubric with clear expectations. I'm a very, very, very big fan of developing the rubrics with my learners. The biggest advantage of doing that is that the learners never complain afterwards about their grades, because they can't, because they made up the rubric, right? And I have never, I mean, maybe 1 or 2 students tried to be funny and said, well, I get 100% for attendance. And then everyone's like, ha, ha, ha. And then they actually start working on the rubric, and you're surprised how fair they are and how aware they are what's important. Usually I'm the one who's saying, no, grammar really shouldn't have such a big, such a percentage. And then I explain why, and then we get into the meta level of language learning and what's really important and what isn't. So that's very, very helpful. Okay. The other suggestion that I have for you is to discuss and decide accommodations as a program. This is the document that I created for my program, where our sales program at ASU offers specific accommodations for learners with different needs. But we really only have these accommodations. We have more time for tests. We have flexible deadlines. You can get a note taker, and you get a change of format. Those are our 4 accommodations. They are so unspecific that for so many of our students, it's kind of like, why do I even bother? It's not going to get me anything, right? So here in green, I have underlined accommodations that any teacher can do in their classroom at any time. In yellow, I have the one that we talked about in our group, in our program, to discuss and see, can we all do that? Because it's really problematic if, for example, I allow my student in my 201 class to do the assessments with noise canceling headphones, and it's really helpful for the student, and then they go into 202 and the teacher says, no, you can't do that. I don't allow that. Who knows what's on your headphones, right? And so that's important to talk as a program about what kind of accommodations do we have here, or for example, that we shouldn't count spelling errors, or that we allow them using spell check, and so on and so forth. So I invite you to sit down with your program and talk about what kind of accommodations you can do as a program specifically for your students that may not be covered by the Disability Center. Any questions about that or comments? Yeah, please.
So I have a student who thinks she has a learning disability, but it's not official. What can I do? So like in generally, like because we have to have a accommodation letter from university, and then we would discuss how we can do it. But without the letter, it's very hard to accommodate the students.
Yeah. That's a great question. And here we have to talk about what are accommodations. I mean, really big the biggest accommodation is that we'd say the person doesn't even need to take a language class, right? That's an accommodation you pretty much never receive. But then there are smaller accommodations, like an accommodation that you, for example, allow the students to always sit in the first row. That's an accommodation that you don't even have to discuss with anyone. And that's why I have the yellow ones, and then I have the green ones. The yellow ones, the green ones are the ones that you can do in your classroom at any time. And that's why I encourage you to sit down with your language and then have accommodations for your language and talk about how far do you want to take it. Do you want to, for example, as a language group, say that in written text, you are not going to count spelling errors in general. I mean, these need to be rules that you can apply for everyone who's coming for you and asking for accommodations. And that is up to you and your program to make that decision. Yeah. And then we always have, a little bit of wiggle room when it comes to, for example, one example that I gave is I had a student with very, very high anxiety. And when I had them come in for an oral exam, they were shaking. And I always do oral exams with a partner. And I was sitting here and they were shaking in front of me. And so what I did is I just turned around and they did their oral exam without me looking at them. That really calmed down their anxiety. So that is something that, there are a lot of things you can do that may not be the overall solution, but that are a really important step forward. Yeah. Sorry, I wish I had a better answer for you, but it's difficult. It's difficult. Okay. Questions about ADHD, autism before we move on to talk a little bit about dyslexia? Okay. Then you can either take your phone or your laptop, or if you have something to write, I would like you to, who knows, you're going to be bored. Okay, you have to write a word. I want you to write a word that doesn't exist, by the way, that is called spone. Spone. Please just write down spone. I'm going to tell you, yeah, that's exactly the look, like spone, what the? Yeah. Us people from Arizona just like to, make up crazy things. Spone is my contribution. Spone. Okay, and then you can put it down, and then we're going to talk about it in a second. Can you read this? Why? Why can you read it? Why can you get a few words out of this? What? How? What's happening in your brain? The beginning and the end? What else? So context, that there's a likelihood that when I have a certain word that another word is following. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Context clues. Okay. Right. 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 Okay. How do we learn a language? How do we even get started? I suppose that all of us are at least bilingual, right? How did you get started? When did you get started? In the womb. Okay. How? How did you get started in the womb? Right. The intonation of mother's talking. Mm-hmm. And then, how did it progress? Repetition. Yeah, hearing words over and over again. Perfect. Okay. Okay. Did you know that actually infants, when they're born, they can understand and learn how to produce all the sounds that exist in the world? And then within the first year, our brain wants to be really efficient. So what the brain does, it's just focusing on the sounds that are actually valuable and meaningful. And that's why it's actually super important, if you do know a second, third, fourth language, that you read to infants in all those different languages, because that keeps their brain open to be able to differentiate all these sounds and to create this awareness for the sounds. So that's why when people ask me and say, do I have to speak a language perfectly to be able to, to pass something on to my child? And I say, absolutely not. Any kind of language exposure is a good exposure, always. How did you start learning to read and write? Who remembers when you started? How? Start with the alphabet. So your mother sat you down and said, it's time now. A, B, C, D, E, F. Okay, so kindergarten repetition. Okay, saying the alphabet in kindergarten. Did anyone start before kindergarten? Yeah?
It's like specifically made for teaching kids how to read English.
Uh-huh.
You would go through and like sound it out with your fingers.
So sound it out. You did it with your dad with the book. Absolutely. And it starts actually even earlier than that, because little kids at age 1.5, 2, as soon as they hold a pen in their hand or a crayon in their hand, they are learning, I can create what I'm saying and hearing and put it onto a piece of paper. So that's when they actually learn that there's a connection between the spoken word and the written word. That's the very earliest. And then they start learning, when I hear a certain sound, I'm going to write a certain letter. So that is then when we have the phoneme, the sound, to grapheme, to the letter combination. So that's where the phoneme grapheme correspondence comes from. And then exactly what you said, what's happening in kindergarten is that we approach it in a very structured way, right? That we learn this is the letter M. Let's find a lot of words that starts with M, and so on and so forth, right? So that is our phoneme grapheme correspondence. The next step after the phoneme grapheme correspondence is, because how many letters do you hear in the word thorough? Yes, exactly. Letters or sounds. How many sounds do you hear? Because letters we don't really hear, right? How many sounds do you hear in thorough? 4. How many letters does the word thorough have? More. That's why we're studying languages and not math. Exactly. So you see, suddenly the phoneme grapheme correspondence, I hear something, I write something, doesn't work anymore. This connection, doesn't work. So I need to take the next step. And here's what the next step is. I want you to say the word tomato backwards to me. Tomato. If you were in my position right now and you had looked at your cells, what happened was this. Why? Which strategy did you just use? Yes, yes, exactly. You see the word written in front of your inner eye and you can manipulate it any way you want. That is the so-called mental graphemic representation. You have a mental graphemic representation of certain of the words in front of your inner eye, and you can manipulate it any way you want. So when you're reading something, intelligence is the ability to adapt, to change. What your mental graphemic representation does is you're giving this kind of input, and your brain is pretty much saying, ooh, this looks very familiar too. Let me see. Intelligence. And it's giving you this word, pretty much. How did you write the word spoon? The same way? Wait, why did you all spell it that way, or most of you spell it that way, despite the fact that you've never heard it? I brought it just yesterday from Arizona, and you already know how to spell it. Why? Yes, yes. So phoneme grapheme correspondence doesn't work, because in my phoneme grapheme correspondence, there's not an E. My mental graphemic representation doesn't really work because I haven't saved that word yet. But you're absolutely right. I have in my mental graphemic representation so many words that are similar that I take the morphological structure that is in this word and I transfer it onto new words. And that is exactly how I can read. So we have the process of phoneme grapheme correspondence to mental graphemic representation. Okay. In our first language, we have phoneme grapheme correspondence, and then we always start with a phoneme grapheme correspondence, and then we develop our mental graphemic representation at the same time. You have 1 minute to discuss how does that work in second language learning. So we already get learners who have a phoneme grapheme correspondence in their first language and a mental graphemic representation in their first language, but now they're learning a second language. How do they do that? I give you a minute. Okay, I hate to interrupt. I'm sorry, these are so valuable conversations. I love that. But we don't have that much time left, so I want to give it a bit more time. So, so what did you come up with? Does it also, is it the same way? Do our second language learners start with phoneme grapheme correspondence? They come to your classroom, first day of classes, first 5 minutes. What do you do? Second language, in your classroom, when you're teaching your language. First 5 minutes of your first class.
So it's sometimes like most of the times it's the opposite of like phoneme graphing. Is like graphing phoneme correspondence. They first see the grapheme and then they attach the phone to it. Because I think we do teach alphabets first and then
that's actually super interesting. How many of you start with the alphabet on day one, first 5 minutes? You don't? You don't? You don't?
Oh, I used to teach Bengali.
Ah, so there's a huge difference also which language we're teaching, right? The approach of how we start, right? So with modern languages, we pretty much never start with the ABCs. We start immediately with, oh, woher kommst du? Wie heißt du? With all the good stuff, right? So what our students are doing is they are usually trying to take advantage of their mental graphemic representation because that's the efficient one. That's the one that works faster. When you're reading a text, how many of you are reading a text by translating each letter into each sound? We don't do that. What we do is our brain quickly scans, that's the word, that's the word, that's the word, and that's how we read really quickly, right? So we use our efficient strategy, the mental graphemic representation, and only if that doesn't work, then the last resort is the phonetic writing, one way of writing, because that's then the last thing we can do. Dyslexia. Where do you think when we talk about phoneme-grapheme correspondence and mental graphemic representation, where does dyslexia fit in there? So far, I haven't even talked about dyslexia. I've just talked about language acquisition. What do you think is not developed as it should be in a person with dyslexia? Phoneme-grapheme correspondence, mental graphemic representation. Take a wild guess. The phoneme-grapheme correspondence. In severe dyslexia, that's exactly what it is. If there's a severe dyslexia, there's a big problem with the phoneme-grapheme correspondence. So the differentiation of minimal pairs of sounds that are very similar, of letters that look very similar, that is 100% what's challenging with dyslexia. Now with, and that's when it's a severe dyslexia. When that's in the phoneme-grapheme correspondence, that's usually for younger children or when it's severe dyslexia. But everyone with dyslexia is struggling with a mental graphemic representation. So this activity that I just did with you, if I, for example, ask you what is the middle letter in the word tomato, right? Where you have to see the word in front of you in your eye and manipulate it so it works. And those activities, I'm not saying diagnose your neighbor when you take out the trash and see if they're dyslexic by asking them to spell tomato backwards. But that is actually a way to see how well the mental graphemic representation works. Yeah. Now, thinking about phoneme-grapheme correspondence and thinking about the mental graphemic representation. So again, phoneme-grapheme correspondence means I can write down everything I hear. There is a letter for every sound. So when I sound it out, it works. Mental graphemic representation is for a lot of the words that are spelled differently than what I hear. Look at this text, try to figure out what the learner wanted to say, and then think about what kind of error this learner made, if it's a phoneme-grapheme correspondence error or a mental graphemic representation error. Go ahead. Okay, what happens in their mind? How do they visualize it? Before I answer that, what if I told you that this is a kindergartner? Oh, I see a lot of faces of people. Oh, wow, that's impressive. What if I told you this is a fifth grader? Ooh, that hurts a bit more, right? Why? Why? Because we have different expectations at different developmental ages. And so it has to be developmentally appropriate. If I told you this is a learner who just moved to the US and has been in the English school system for 3 months, then it would be really impressive, right? So we have to look at how old this learner is and what the expectations are. In this case, it's actually a third grade girl who wrote this text. And let's look, and I think that's gonna explain your question. What are aspects here that the learner has done really well, where the learner has really thought about it? Grammar, sentence structure, good.
All the sounds are kind of there, but they're just represented by different, I mean, she just writes it in a different way than we would.
Yes, yes. And that is so important to see everything, all the skills that the person has already mastered, right? So they are all the sounds that are already there and that were done really, really well. So, for example, what do you think of the word story?
That really caught my attention.
Yeah, why did it get your attention?
British story or some other format where the R is like doesn't exist.
Beautiful, thank you. So you just said where the R may not exist. And this is the reason why ideally when we do an error analysis, we would have to listen to the person saying it. Because if this little girl is saying, I'm writing a story, then there's actually no phoneme-grapheme correspondence problem there, because the person very clearly wrote the letter that is connected to the W sound, right? And so and then it became a mental graphemic representation error and not a phoneme grapheme correspondence error anymore. Yes. Did you?
Here is the correspondence too. Like W represents R because in the early stage, R is difficult for American students too, like kids too. So they will start with W or U for R. So
Absolutely.
it's not missing, it's just there in a different way.
And that's why an error is not an error. We need to look at the age of the person. We need to look at the background of the person. We need to look earlier with the Germans. I had an example of a student of mine who is Hispanic, and she wrote importante. And knowing that, where she was coming from, it totally makes sense. So we need to look like at more than just the error. So your questions, what do these learners see? So what they try to do is look at how amazing the person wrote the word because. That's a really difficult long word, and she wrote it almost all correct. So what's happening is the mental graphemic representation is not, it's not that it's not there at all. It just means that it's not as strong as it should be. So there can be some words where they put a lot of focus into knowing these words and then writing these really difficult words correctly, and then a relatively simple word incorrectly. And so what they do is what I had earlier here, where they use the last resort. You will always start trying, once you have a mental graphemic representation, you will always start trying to use that first. But if that doesn't work, then I have to resort back to the phoneme grapheme correspondence. And that is what's really problematic. So this I showed earlier. I just wanted to show you as a way of what you can do. So what I developed is an error analysis sheet where pretty much I'm looking at the phoneme grapheme correspondence errors, the mental graphemic representation errors, and specific errors between German and English interference. Because it makes a huge difference what the first language is and what the second language is, and the interference in between those languages. So based on an error analysis, when I go through the errors and say the error is here, this is an error, I can actually then, where is it? Here's an example that I did in German. I can then see where the bulk of errors is, and that gives me the information of how I can help this learner in the classroom. So what I do is at the beginning of the semester for my writing assignments, I have them write a text. I do an error analysis, and then I can give each student their individual error analysis and say, here's what you can work on. And this is your individual, and sometimes we have individual assignments that they do throughout the semester. But I also get information for my group as a whole to see if, for example, there is a ton of capitalization errors within the class, then that is what I'm going to do in my class. All of this is beneficial for every single student, but especially beneficial for my students with dyslexia. Because this is the structured way of seeing where they're struggling and where I need to start. So here, for example, this student made a lot of errors with the German R. And so what I did in class is I implemented a lot of pronunciation activities with the R, of how to hear the R, how to say the R, to recognize the R in German, and so on and so forth. And that then has increased the error by, like, for this individual student. Because if we are working on everything, then this specific student is going to be really bored here, really bored here, really bored here, and has to wait pretty much for the second half of the semester until we finally do what we're supposed to do. So that's why it's very, very helpful to have an error analysis like this. And you see in this error analysis sheet that I have simplified it a lot, where for phoneme grapheme correspondence, I just say consonants and vowels. And then I have here the German-English interference errors. So you can simplify it as much as you want for your individual language. And my recommendation is simplify it so much that you can actually use it in the classroom, because all this is wonderful data and really interesting. And the students love, by the way, when they get their individual sheet and they're like, ooh, this is very data driven. It is, but it doesn't get you anything if you don't know what to do with it in the classroom. So that's super important. Okay. Okay. Maybe we do this for like just 2 or 3 minutes, and then we can talk about the rest, and then we have 10 more minutes to answer questions. Okay, these are typical classroom situations with learners, neurodiverse learners, but especially also learners with dyslexia. I want you to take a minute or two. You don't have to talk through all of them. Just pick 2 or 3 where you think, or where you think through ideas of how you could help learners with dyslexia in these situations. Is it, let me try. Oh, yes, I can. But let me see if I can, then let's just take the first 5, but this way it's larger. Is that good? Okay, perfect. You go ahead. Let me learn from you. Let me see what kind of solutions you have, because I love that I always get new input from all the experienced teachers and their ideas, what to do. Who wants to share ideas that you've just discussed? Yeah.
So I have a student with dyslexia,
Uh-huh.
and he's a heritage learner.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the things in the beginning, it was very difficult to read for him. So obviously, there are times we kind of worked around a way that I will ask other students, and I give him a warning at the beginning. Okay, we'll take turns in reading, and I'll give you number 10. I'll come to you. So I don't want him to feel completely excluded. So he gets some time to process that while the others are doing it. That works. And the other thing is for grammar. He is this student is heritage, but also does not have the meta language for grammatical terms. So even if we go through it, it's like, okay, it kind of takes some processing time.
Right.
But the fact that we have worked together for almost end of the second semester now, so we kind of worked around a way, like if I'm doing some reading next class, I would just say, hey, we're going to do this.
Yeah.
So you can just take a look at it rather than looking at it with a fresh eye with everyone else. So just a little bit of time for prepping.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Great. Wonderful. And this is really helpful, not just for dyslexia, but also for learners with ADHD and with autism. The better you are prepared, the easier you make it for your students. It is so important. It is so important to just make sure that you upload your slides, to make, whether you do flipped classroom or not, to make sure that you have it all there. Super important, especially when it comes to the writing, since we're at the university, allow them to quickly snap a picture with their phone, right? So they don't have to write everything down that you see on the whiteboard, but you can just quickly snap the picture and have it there. I even do that as a teacher, that I sometimes, when there's a whiteboard writing of, if something new came up that I didn't plan on before, I take the picture and I'll upload it to our Canvas, so it's all there. It's really, really important. The more organized you are, the better it is for everyone, for every single person. Yes, absolutely. Whoa, for every person. How did I do that? That was fancy. I didn't know I could do that. I'm still surprising myself. See that? Okay. Here are ideas of what you can do. And what I want you to know is usually in my workshops, what I want you to do, and you're going to get the QR code to all of these, so you don't have to read through everything right now. But what I want you to do, ideally, that would be my wish, is that you are picking one single thing here that you feel that you could implement in your classroom tomorrow when you go in and when you teach, because just making this one little change is so impactful for your students. And again, this is almost all of this is for all of our students, and not just for students with dyslexia or then with ADHD or with autism. And I have here I have here in the middle, if you want to scan this one too, there's another handout with more information for ADHD, dyslexia, and autism together. And I hope that should work. Okay. And of course, this is usually when I talk about dyslexia and ADHD and autism, each one of these workshops is usually 3 hours. So I did like a 6-hour workshop now in an hour and a half. So that's why it felt really rushed, because it was really rushed. And there's a good chance that I missed out on some questions. However, I think it's super important. That's why we have 10 minutes left to get into a conversation. So amongst yourselves, or of course with me as well, please ask questions, clarifications, ideas, maybe something I haven't talked about. Please.
I mean, I think, a lot of us do not have that understanding of how to differentiate the different symptoms of ADHD or autism. I guess that's the first thing, because a lot of times the fact that autism is a spectrum and it's so diverse.
Absolutely.
And it's like every person you meet with autism is that one person you meet because of their uniqueness.
Mm-hmm.
So I think within our spectrum and with the limited scope of interaction within just 50 minutes of class a day, it's very difficult to identify among students unless they come forward with their diagnosis or have a detailed discussion.
Yes, and thank you so much for saying that. That is so important. The really good thing is we do not need to diagnose. We do not need to put, even if it's just for our mind, label on, oh, this person probably has, ADHD or autism. That's why I love the idea of we're making changes in our classrooms for everyone, but they're especially beneficial for learners with certain needs. So to implement the cooperative learning methods. And then we are all such experienced teachers that when we observe them, we can see which student is really uncomfortable in these social interactions. And then we can see which students, when I say, who wants to read it aloud, can immediately go like that, right? Or when I'm working in groups on the whiteboard and I say, who wants to write that down? And they look away. So we read the body language of our students, knowing when they feel comfortable or uncomfortable, and then not pushing them to do it. I think that is the best advice. And also taking the burden that we always or often put on ourselves as teachers, that we have to help everyone to the most degree. We cannot to the full degree, because we have students with all different needs and we have the neurotypical students who have every right to get just as much attention, right? And so that's that's why the best thing you can do is make these little changes for everyone. And the neurodiverse students are going to be the ones that are going to be benefiting from them the most. Yeah. And that's super nice in theory and so much harder to put into practice. But also remember that even making one change is so much more than not making the change. And so step by step, that's what I did with my universal design. I was unable to change my whole class into universal design. So I do every semester, I do another unit because otherwise I would be completely overwhelmed with work. Yeah. Other questions, concerns, suggestions?
I was really curious about how you design rubrics collaboratively with the students, and I would just love to hear sort of how you set that up, how much time you spend to do it, how you guide them through it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. So, for example, in my third year German minor major communication class, we have one unit is to be is politeness, of asking, like having a polite conversation. And so I start with a blank page and I sit them down in groups and I say to them, and we start with doing some role plays so that they know the prompts of what politeness is and the cultural background of politeness. And then I say, okay, if you were the teacher, what would you give points for? And then usually they start with, well, I mean, it needs to be grammatically correct, 50 points out of 100. And then someone else is saying, and then if it is extreme like that, then I interfere and I say, so pretty much if someone is saying to me, let's say in English, the lawnmower is delicious today. So I say, so that would give you 50% because it's grammatically correct sentence. Oh, well, no, yeah, you're right. It's probably more. So it's also vocabulary. And so we walk through the different scenarios of what that would look like. And then they apply it by using their rubric with other students. And they are, so to say, grading then other students to apply their rubric and see if it works. And then through that concept, and then they go into different groups, present their rubrics, go back into their original groups and see if the rubrics can be, must be manipulated in any way and changed until we then have a democratic vote at the end of how this is going to be. And I've done this for, I think, 10 years or so. I had it maybe once that I would have done it 5 to 10% differently, but pretty much always it ends up being what I would have done anyways. I recommend it whenever you have the time because it's time intense. Yeah. So it does take time. So I would do it when it's especially important, or when it's an assignment where you feel like it's even more important that the students have an understanding and the transparency of grading. Yeah, no worries. Other questions, concerns? Yes, please.
Yeah, I find it really interesting when you say that the teacher should support the student, but it's not their obligation to help them with their disorders.
Oh,
So
yeah.
did you communicate with them about the things that they should do, like be outside of the classroom to help them with?
Oh, I would
Yeah.
never. I
Yeah.
would never, because that
Yeah.
means that I would dare saying that someone has a diagnosis or not. If a student came to me and said to me, I know you're the specialist about dyslexia. I'm really trying to find ways of helping myself outside of the classroom. Do you have any suggestions? What I say is, well, I can tell you research has shown that these and these and these structures are the most helpful, but it is on you to pretty much look if there's someone around here, because that's too much of a hot topic for me. That's not something. I help them with information about, you know, their when they're coming to me and asking that, but I would never approach a student and say, I think you may have ADHD, because that's
what I was curious
No,
about,
no,
because they
no.
need to come to you first about
Oh,
their problem,
100%. 100%. Yes. And I of course, I have situations where I'm 1000% sure that that person may have ADHD or not, but it is absolutely not my job to comment on it or to suggest anything, or nope. Mm-mm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
And I just wanted to first say thank you so much for coming and speaking with us
Yeah.
today. And my question is, I find it really interesting how you try to find ways to implement like a classroom setting that really satisfy every student, right? I'm interested in how do you implement this, or like how do you know like when to implement certain changes that like you're able to help like majority of the students?
Oh, that's a great question. So when I started teaching at ASU about 15 years ago, I started with the simplest one, which is the take a picture with your phone. And now that's second nature to me, like because I've done it so much. And I'm trying to set the goal for myself that every semester I have one little new thing that I'm trying to implement to really help my students, because it only makes sense if you've done it so many times and repetitive that it is part of your teaching nature. So that's why I want the people in the workshops to just start with one little thing, because if you have the expectation of yourself that you can put all this into action within 2 weeks, that's absolutely impossible. So that's why taking one thing, another thing, and then maybe in 5 years you have 5 things, that would be amazing. Yeah, absolutely. Other questions? And of course, I want you to reach out to me if you have any questions, any concerns, if you have any follow-up questions. I don't think, send me an email. I have a reading list that I didn't put up there. So if you're interested in that, definitely let me know about some research right now on the topics. And thank you so much for giving up 90 minutes of beautiful sunshine in Ithaca. That was a hard price to pay. Thank you.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for all this information, for helping us understand the differences and all the ways that we can improve our own teaching and our interaction with students. I think there's a lot that we all learned from this wonderful workshop. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for everybody joining us here in person. And for those of you online, thank you as well. But thank you again, Sarah. Vielen Dank.
Sehr gern.
Es war wundervoll.
Wunderbar.
Wir hätten ja gar nichts anderes erwartet. And thank you all. Good luck with the rest of the spring semester. And we look forward to seeing you all soon.